Dr. Heike Schroeder is Professor of Environmental Governance at the School of International Development at the University of East Anglia in the UK. Her work focuses on global environmental politics, forest governance, and REDD+, and the role of non-state actors in the current negotiating process and urban climate governance. From 2007 to 2011, Heike was a Tyndall Senior Research Fellow and an Oxford Martin Senior Fellow in Forest Governance at the Environmental Change Institute, University of Oxford. That's actually where I met Heike. She and I shared an office and we became close friends. So I just want to also say a few personal words. It's very easy when you're working in the world of climate justice to get, jaded and maybe even sort of angry and anxious. And one of the things I really appreciate about Heike is how she always manages to retain a deep inner peace and sense of equanimity, and also just a real, she comes at her work with a great big reservoir of kindness and generosity. And it's this sort of spirit that allows her to bring together very different kinds of people, from indigenous people to supposedly high-level climate negotiators, and bring them together and help them find some common ground. But it also has helped me practically. So when she and I shared an office, like if I was feeling particularly anxious, she would suggest that we pause and we did a little meditation in our office. And so we used to do that. We used to close the door and turn down the lights and sit for 5 minutes and meditate in our office and kind of re-ground ourselves as a way of kind of coming back to our work. So I really appreciate that about Heike. And so thank you, Heike, for your friendship and for your great work, and welcome to Terra. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Kamal, for these very kind words, and hello everybody from around the world. I was really quite curious, Kamal, whether or not you'd give away that we used to meditate in our offices, and sometimes because we had a window that people could actually look into our office from the corridor, we'd have some faces like noses, on a screen, kind of wondering what we were up to in the dark, because we would turn off the light as well. So yes, it's a great pleasure to be joining you in this very exciting new enterprise of a 9-week course on climate change. Okay, so I suppose I'm adding to a kind of broader background on climate change policy and governance. And what I want to give is this kind of small slice of the role of Indigenous peoples. And this is very much something that has come about in the very, recent, let's say, 10 years or so. So why Indigenous peoples? Why are they relevant to climate change? And maybe perhaps in particular to REDD+. Well, so Indigenous peoples are perhaps today more talked about than they have even just, a few years ago. But they would form approximately 5% of the world's population. This is a very general estimate. It's quite difficult, and obviously there's all kind of shades of grey of indigeneity out there these days, because they often live in kind of mixed kind of environments where they might retreat back to their bushes, but then come into the villages and try and get their kids to school. So they do both. They kind of retain their traditional lives, but they also interact in some ways in maybe local market spaces. That said, they still roughly they manage 11% of the world's lands. They also customarily own, occupy, or use in some way between, I think it was 22 and 65% of the world's land surface. That is a lot. That is a lot, and obviously also because they are spread quite widely. And also they contribute thereby a significant amount of tons of carbon saved. And of course, it's again a bit difficult to pinpoint exactly how much, but here's one estimate of, it could be 312 billion tons of carbon. So despite having contributed maybe the least to global warming, because they traditionally lead low carbon ways of life, they are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change. And that is because they predominantly live in ecosystems particularly prone to effects of climate change, because they can be found in the polar regions, the small islands, mountains, humid tropics, coastal regions, and deserts. They also heavily depend on their lands and the resources from their lands for their basic sustenance and livelihoods, including food, medicine, shelter, fuel, etc. So they can be seen amongst the economically poorest, the most marginalized people globally for that reason. And in addition, mitigation and adaptation efforts by non-Indigenous groups have potentially adverse effects on the livelihoods of Indigenous peoples, especially their customary lands to rights and natural resources. Okay, so you might have already wondered as you were listening, what do we actually mean by Indigenous? What is Indigenous exactly? And there's not necessarily a universally agreed upon definition, but amongst the definitions out there, I think this one is used quite commonly, and it's United Nations 2016, and it says Indigenous communities, peoples, and nations are those which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the society that is now prevailing on those territories or parts of them. They form at present non-dominant sectors of society and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their ethnic identity as the basis of their continued existence as peoples in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal systems. So here we have it. I want to now give you three examples of how this plays out. The first one in the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change itself, and I assume that you've already heard quite a bit about this process, but you can also ask me more questions if you like in the Q&A afterwards. So the emergence and also growth of Indigenous participation, but especially activism, at international policy spaces, in particular the UNFCCC, and also mainly in response to REDD+, has really, started to be seen in the last so many years, maybe 5 years, 10 years is when it started. But by 2015, so 5 years ago already, there was quite a significant turnout of representation, 1,000 people, which was about 3% of the participants of the big Paris Agreement conference where the Paris Agreement was adopted. And they are increasingly seen to be, part of panels and events. But the question is really, to what extent are they being seen? To what extent is it just kind of en vogue to have an Indigenous representative, at their view, and to what extent are they actually really also heard, and how? Yet, we can probably say that political norms around their inclusion are changing. And of course, I'm giving you a very kind of broad, overview. There's a lot more detail, obviously, to all this. But you could say that there are three documents that clearly showcase these changes of political norms. The first one is Agenda 21 from 1992, which actually, sorry, I'm playing around with your pictures. I'm just going to try and, okay, here I can see everything. So Agenda 21 declares that sustainable development activities should aim toward achieving a better understanding of Indigenous people's knowledge and management experience. Then the 2015 Agenda 30 very famously is guided by an overarching principle of leaving no one behind, and obviously that would include Indigenous peoples. And then 2015, the Paris Agreement actually has a mention of the UNFCCC Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform, which has in subsequent years been negotiated and adopted, which aims to catalyze learning, engagement, and policy coordination that benefits local communities and Indigenous peoples, as well as the international community, through diversifying knowledge systems and promoting knowledge integration. And you could think, say that this is actually quite an innovative step, because it, in a way, gives Indigenous peoples even more rights, more voice than other constituencies, other non-party stakeholders, as they're mentioned as well, other observer organizations in the process. Okay, so next case, Bolivia. So here's a case of a country to just look at a different level of governance, as it were. And also these are cases from a project that I'm carrying out. So we're actually going into these countries, Bolivia, and the next one will be Papua New Guinea, and working with an indigenous community around issues of climate change and resource extraction. So Bolivia is an interesting case because it has one of the most advanced legal frameworks for protecting indigenous people's rights. And this is the result of the 2009 plurinational nation-state constitution, which grants the country's 33 indigenous nations the right to their autonomy, their own form of development, territory, intercultural education, and free, prior, and informed consent. And since that time, so in the last about 10 years, Bolivia has then put into practice a land distribution process to hand back to its various 33 indigenous nations their territories, and this has been done to about 20%. And this is being done through what's called the communal territories of origin, or in Spanish, TCOs. And these have important implications for the management of common property resources, such as forests, as they provide an additional legal framework for local control and property rights over natural resources, such as forests. However, subsoil minerals, as elsewhere, remains the property of the Bolivian state. They recognize communal lands and traditional territories of indigenous nations as independent entities, therefore, for the first time. So when we now look at one of these indigenous nations, the indigenous territory of Lomerio, it's an area that spans about 260,000 hectares, and it's located kind of in the department of Santa Cruz, which is kind of in the eastern lowlands of Bolivia. There you find the Moncox indigenous peoples, and they legally own and manage their land now as of 2006. So they were the first ones to have gained their right to territorial indigenous autonomy. And although this is fact, kind of this is agreed on paper, of course, the struggle continues, and there's a lot of dynamic around what this really means, and not everyone is necessarily always on the same page, as it were, in terms of whether to continue with traditional indigenous norms or to adopt Western norms. So today, the emphasis is very much on communal ownership of resources, and this is very much supported by the indigenous alliances, the indigenous local chiefs, but not necessarily by the municipal government that is also run by the same people, the Moncox people. And so in the dynamic toward perhaps changing governance structures, there's now climate change happening, and so in additional challenges are thereby created for a peoples that is struggling to gain autonomy. And in the area that we visited, the big two, I would say, were a drying of a river that therefore has reduced their access to fish as one source of protein. And the other big issue has been forest fires, and they've been hit quite severely. And actually, as of today, they are also fighting COVID-19. Okay, and then the third case, Papua New Guinea. And this is a very different country to Bolivia in that customary rights that are kind of, prevalent in terms that there is 97% of land is under customary rights. The government itself has not respected this, nor free, prior, informed consent, nor has it ratified any international agreements, for example, the UN DRIP, the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. PNG is also houses some of the biggest gold, silver, and nickel reserves and mines in the world. And it has a very unregulated environment, which is therefore very attractive, obviously, to multinationals who can easily exploit these resources. And then these resources are not at all shared yet with the indigenous communities that live adjacent. And so they receive no benefits, but only experience the very severe environmental damages. We went to an area called Tabubil, where the Octave Mine is. The Octave Mine is a big copper and gold mine, the third largest in the world, has been in operation since 1984, and has led to very serious environmental devastation around the area, and therefore is also known as an example of industrial malpractice. And so this, plays out in a way that whilst these people are traditional hunters, they cannot anymore find anything to hunt. There are no more wild animals, no bushmeat available in the area. There's a lot of pollution, I suppose, that the people don't really understand yet, and still they are experiencing early cases of cancer in very young people, and they have no health infrastructure in the area. So the area it contains an ethnic groups that are in some way interrelated, but also speak a lot of different languages. The region is remote, inaccessible, only accessible by plane. And really the infrastructure that exists only exists for the mine and doesn't reach any of the surrounding villages. So again, there's a lot more detail to this, but just to say that a situation that is already quite tense and difficult for Indigenous peoples is again exacerbated by climate change that has brought about reduced rainfall, drought, increased landslides, and also an interesting kind of dynamic around how diverse people have diverse interpretations as to why the climate is changing. So to wrap up, as a conclusion, we can say that the kind of Indigenous climate change interactions are at different stages, play out in different ways, in certain regards in different places. So the UNFCCC, we see kind of a gradual process of institutionalization, of greater participation through the Indigenous Peoples platform. Bolivia, we see a process of implementation of framework regulating communal rights and practices. And in Papua New Guinea, we see kind of early stages of a process of gaining voice in the context of benefits from resource extraction and lack of institutional framework. I want to leave you with this. So here's a quote by an Indigenous representative at the UNFCCC who says, sometimes it's different to speak the colonists' language. This is a challenge because of how you interpret concepts, how you interpret words or worldviews. We're getting better and better at this because we don't want to be on the outside of the game. And here's a list of references And if you are interested in the project that I mentioned, it's called the INDIS project, right at the bottom, standing for Indigenous International Interactions for Sustainable Development. And the website is indisproject.org. Okay, so I now stop sharing and see you all again.
Thank you so much, Heike. That was a really great introduction to this topic, and also really relevant to some other content we'll be covering in coming up next week and the following, after our focus this week on energy and climate change. And I'm just wondering, before I get into the guest lecture Slack channel from our learners' questions, if you could just provide a little bit more of an explanation of the RED Plus program and Indigenous involvement, because that is something that's coming up in class 14 that it would just be helpful for you to shed some light on for our group before we get to the slides content.
Okay, sure. So as you know, the Kyoto Protocol from 1997 failed to address the issue of avoided deforestation. It did actually include in the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanisms, options of afforestation and reforestation, but not avoided deforestation, which is really where the bulk of the emissions lie. And it wasn't done so at the time because of a lot of methodological issues, but also sovereignty issues. You know, countries with a lot of forests didn't want to have their sovereignty played with, impeded upon. So it was left out. But even already for years after, definitely, certainly by 2005, countries came forward and said, well, this is a big, slice of the pie of emissions that we need to address. There were some studies done that showed like it could be about 20% maybe of emissions. I think now we're more like saying 13 to 17% of emissions come from deforestation. It's quite a big chunk. It's bigger than transport to leave out. And so with the opportunity of the kind of continuation of negotiations, I primarily, to negotiate a second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol, but which wasn't so straightforward because the US had not ratified. So a second track was started for negotiations for long-term cooperative action. And within that, there was the opportunity to look at RED+. So this was done, and by 2007, RED+ had gained a huge kind of following. It was a very popular topic. There was a big event happening, Forest Day at 2007, the Bali conference, but also there was this new report that had come out by Lord Stern, Nicholas Stern, the economics of climate change. And he actually said that reducing emissions from deforestation was a cheap mitigation option. And this sounded very promising to many countries. So it was certainly very much supported and propelled forward, to the extent that RED+ made a lot of good strides in the early years. There was good consensus around RED+, much more so than on a lot of the other issues that were negotiated kind of in those years. Initially toward 2009, the Copenhagen conference, where the Copenhagen Accord agreement was meant to be adopted, but that didn't happen, as you know. So in those years, there was already a lot of detail discussed. So 2008, I think it was, as an example, the US managed to change the reference to Indigenous peoples in the draft treaty text to Indigenous people. So that's a big difference in terms of, the status that these people would have internationally under international law. So there was an outcry. And it soon just became evident that a RED+ mechanism would seriously impact Indigenous peoples who live in the forests. The forests are not uninhabited. They are inhabited, not densely, but they are inhabited by numerous Indigenous communities. And some of them, these still live quite in isolation, but many of these unfortunately cannot anymore. And this is not by their own choosing, but it started through missionizing and then extraction, and now also experiencing climatic impacts, and most recently even, you know, being somewhat negatively affected from conservation efforts that would change the rules as to how they could, you know, how they could live in the forest. There've been also, you know, migration has been forced upon them in such ways. So with that, in those years, increasingly Indigenous representatives came to the climate negotiations, and in early years, I think they were just angry and nobody really took them seriously. And then they started to really learn and started to be much more strategic and much more kind of willing to cooperate, much more positive and also much more informed and kind of professional perhaps. And this happens very much through quite a kind of, you know, hierarchy. Well, there's a number of very, very influential Indigenous alliances now. For example, in Latin America, it's COICA. And they represent Latin American countries, the indigenous peoples in the various Latin American countries. And they have kind of, you know, indigenous representatives who very much are part of the international policy debate. And so they're therefore quite well known now, and you know, you will find them at every international meeting, as it were. So I think they have managed to avert some of the issues, you know, but there's still a lot at stake for them.
Thank you. That's really helpful to just give us some introductory thoughts on REDD+, because we'll be diving into that a little deeper. And thanks to a lot of your slides that you've already shared with us on that. So I'm going to turn it over to the Slack channel for some questions from our group. Let's see, Toro, would you like to ask your question first to get us started?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Heike. That was really, there's just so much not known about the subject here, at least, that all of it was very, very insightful. But what I'm really trying to understand is that a lot of subject matter or a lot of efforts that are being put in the place for the Indigenous community actually tend to be seen by the governments as activism. Are you really seeing any change in the government's perspective? Are they being inclusive of the Indigenous communities? Because in places like India, we have a lot of Indigenous communities, but it's almost like, you know, they don't have a choice.
Yeah, I think there's quite a variety in terms of how governments deal with Indigenous communities. There's some, you know, very bad practices, I suppose currently, you know, Brazil is one of those. And then those countries with better practices and certainly, you know, who support the Indigenous communities would be maybe Bolivia, definitely also Guatemala, Ecuador, those kinds of countries. I'm not sure about these days, but definitely in earlier days of the Philippines. So these are countries who have had Indigenous representatives also on their national delegations. I would say it really varies a lot. And of course, even if a government is fairly positive, like Canada, you know, you can see that the rhetoric is quite positive. That doesn't mean that there are no issues. And so, you know, Indigenous struggles certainly still continue. New Zealand is a good example now. I think they have, you know, rectified a lot, but more, you know, still is certainly needed.
Thank you.
Definitely. Let's see. Yeah, I have a related question to that, but I'm going to hold on to it for a second and turn it over to Tim to ask his question.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Heike. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. So a specific question about Bolivia. You mentioned that the indigenous people regained kind of control of their lands, but the government maintained control of the minerals underneath the lands. That seems, I interpreted that as kind of a loophole of sorts that would allow that government to still kind of do whatever they want to extract in the future if they wanted to, even if that wasn't, if that was against the wishes of the indigenous people. Is that an accurate interpretation of that? And then a broader question is, have you seen anywhere on Earth where governments have given full control and ownership, the land, above the land and below the land, to indigenous people?
That's a really good question. I don't know of an example of a country that has done, but I wouldn't say that I'm the expert on it. So it may exist and I just don't know about it. I know that with all, you know, co-management arrangements that exist also in the, you know, northwestern America, you know, United States and Canada, they still would have subsoil belonging to the state. There's certainly a lot of challenge around you know, who owns the forest, and there are oftentimes kind of overlapping and conflicting legal frameworks, you know, that could be partly traditional customary law but also then statutory law, you know, and only kind of put in place because there might be the, you know, an advantage to owning the forest if there's internationally you know, money to be had. So Bolivia, I mean, compared to a lot of other countries, at least it has a regulatory framework in their favor. And that doesn't mean it's implemented completely. And I suppose what I've learned from my visit to this area is that even amongst the indigenous community members, there's a lot of you know, diversity of opinion as to what their future should look like. And some preserve traditional ways and others just want to modernize as soon as possible. You know, younger generations often kind of vote with their feet. In some cases, you know, they want to go into the cities, and then in some cases they also just come back and say it was terrible, it was alienating, you know, it wasn't how they expected. Nothing is really straightforward, I think. Yeah. I think, I mean, Ecuador has been a good example of this conflict around, you know, exploiting minerals and subsoil and what can be done to avoid it. And there's always this struggle because also these indigenous communities that we work with, you know, they do also want somewhat better material, you know, material resources. They want schools and roads and infrastructure, and you know, now they need medicine in Bolivia, and it all costs money. So they're quite open also to having revenues, you know, come in, streams of revenue. So in the case of this particular area in Lomerio, they have mines, they have small scale artisanal mines as well. So but it's communal, so everybody owns it. Nobody can, you know, claim it's theirs. Everybody can mine and sell. I don't know if I answered your question enough, Tim.
Yeah, that was a really good question, and thank you for your answer, Heike. I was also confused by that, like how, you know, the subsurface distinction, because, you know, I just think I study agriculture and I think of trees and plants with roots, and I feel like if you own the subsurface, I mean, you're probably more likely to be after the minerals and not the roots of plants, but of course, like those are down there too. So it kind of feels like you're literally undermining the things above ground, and that's an interesting way of thinking about it in the examples you described in Bolivia and Ecuador. And yeah, it seems like more negotiating to be done, I guess, to share the rights and the access in equitable economic terms. Yeah. Let's see, let me get to Sean and then Deepankar. Sean, do you want to answer or ask your question from the Slack?
I thank you so much for your comments so far, and for all the knowledge that you're sharing with us. My question is about whether I'm wondering, is there any movement to like actually include indigenous peoples individually or in some way collectively as like actual parties to the Conference of the Parties?
yeah, a good question as well. So I guess they would love to have that outcome, but it's something that many countries are also very much against. Now, I think that even if they are quietly against, they're not going to openly state these. So they're going to be quite reserved and not necessarily push this agenda item. But this platform was supported by a small number of countries. And I think the indigenous communities, the indigenous representatives really worked hard to speak and to, gain acceptance of this, because they argued that whatever was decided was actually going to directly affect their livelihoods, which was different to other constituencies. That already is a huge, change. If they have, access in that way, they have more access than other constituencies. To have them be on a par with governments, I think that would really revolutionize our, state system, our nation state system. I mean, these days you can't rule out anything anymore, but that would be really quite revolutionary. Even in a context of Canada, and I've watched this happen, where the First Nations would be speaking, and they would have, they wouldn't always be allowed to speak, depending on what the kind of the norms of the specific meeting where they might find themselves. They would or not be able to speak officially if they weren't part of the national delegation. So there's definitely sensitivity around this question of, who other than national governments, parties would have the right to speak in formal settings that would primarily, be those of negotiating text. Yeah, I can say more, but I think that's probably a good start.
Yeah, thanks for that. Deepankar, you had a slightly related question, I think. So do you want to go ahead and ask it?
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Heike. So basically, I just wanted to understand, like, what is your take on citizenship and the indigenous people? And do you think defining their citizenship is somewhere aligning them to the Western norms? So just want to understand your opinion on that.
Yeah, also really good question. And it's really hard sometimes, because in today's world, you have to have a national passport. You can't, you're not a legal person who can travel internationally without it. And so I think, the negotiating, kind of representing indigenous people, they have passports, and so they are part of, the nation state system. And then it depends, I think, on the specific country, how they're recognized. And again, let's say Indonesia doesn't recognize its indigenous peoples at all. It just says, we're all indigenous. Every Indonesian is indigenous, therefore nobody is indigenous, is the official kind of, government take. And then you look at in New Zealand, and you see a lot more recognition for the the nationhood, nationality, and that might be, pluralist. And you see that also in Bolivia. It's a plurinational state. So there are, multiple nations that are accommodated for. But this might work within a national government, national kind of context, or government is a country context, but not necessarily internationally. We're not that far along that you could travel, on a Maori passport. I'm not sure. I don't think so, though. Not that I've heard.
Thanks so much for that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, Tim, you want to go ahead and ask your second question? I think that's a great question, and sort of linked broadly to what we're hoping all guest speakers will shed on to let some light on for our cohort, for those seeking to transition into climate-related work.
Yeah, My question is just, do you have any recommendations or guidance for anyone who's eager to transition their career into advocacy for Indigenous peoples through the lens of climate change? That's kind of where I came from when joining Terra, and have only gained more excitement and interest. So any guidance you have would be appreciated. And I also took note of Indus Project, and we'll check that out.
Great, yeah. Advocacy for, well, there's a lot of advocacy out there on the part of also NGOs. And some, I think, do great work, and others you can kind of be a bit careful, because it's always tricky, like who sets the agenda. And if you really want to be advocates for them, you need to have them set the agenda and really only, do what they want, the way they want it. I think these days they're realizing something that they really need to do is to learn our ways more. So, understand our science better, understand our systems better, and so really help them in understanding this, and sharing the knowledge with them, so that they understand what they need to, what is best for them to do, basically. So that's one. I think is also they love if their cause is being shared more broadly. So any ways that their plight and their stories and their hardships can be shared internationally, so that there's an awareness that's raising in terms of what we're doing to them with our lifestyles inadvertently. We don't even know what we do in terms of how we promote, how we support exploitation of their lands. Really, really badly, in all sorts of ways. So what we eat, what we consume, etc., etc., and the environmental pollution that that leaves behind for them as well.
Yeah, thank you. I've always thought of Indigenous people as those who have knowledge to share with non-Indigenous, and hadn't thought of it the other way, that I might have something to offer to them as well in that sense.
I think they have a lot of knowledge to share with us, and only some of us are interested. I think there's a lot more to be done to really also open doors for them to speak in a way. And even that, a lot of what they have to say still, falls on deaf ears sometimes, because their views, their values are very difficult for the Western mind to make sense of. If as soon as you get into non-human dimensions, the Western mind kind of shuts down. But this is a very important area, for them, a very important element of their worldview. So I think the more that we can educate ourselves, or open our minds up to really, really hearing what they have to say, the better.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. And yeah, this is reminding me, I was able to go up to Alaska to work with a professor on her research while I was in grad school. And while I was there, I read a great book on sort of the coalescence of Indigenous peoples' knowledge with Western climate science. And it was sort of a fascinating example of both parties sort of being able to listen to each other and communicate across, cultural lines, and communicate in a way that both made it possible for Indigenous peoples to preserve their traditional hunting practices, and for their knowledge to feed into Western climate science that was sort of incorrectly predicting some changes for that area up till that communication. So I'll share that resource with our cohort, because it seems like, yeah, something to look out for and build on.
And who was this person? Who was the?
It was Professor Margaret Torn, who does research on warming patterns in the Arctic and plant migrations further north around the Arctic Circle, up in Barrow and Nome, Alaska. So there was I think it's called like The Sign of the Whale, or something. I don't know. I'll post the name of the book, because it's a great thing on this two-way knowledge exchange. So let's see, I think we have a few more questions from Ha and Sean. So Ha, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, so my question is that, obviously, I think a lot of indigenous rights and concerns have been with respect to sort of land use, like forest use and pollution, which is, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, and they are very important concerns in the bigger climate fight. I just wonder if you also know of cases where there are like activism of indigenous rights with respect to, let's say, a bit more global kind of like greenhouse gas emissions, like sort of the traditional climate change temple, yeah, or like if they, what do they have to say about like renewable energy, or like if they want to modernize themselves, that is that in the conversation?
Okay, so one thing, and this is actually also a little bit going back to your question, Tim, and what I've heard someone say at a conference. So there was an indigenous person at a conference in Arizona, and they just said, you know, as the heat, you know, as it gets hotter, what we do is we adapt. So we just, you know, move further up the mountain, further up the hills. So I think that's a really important lesson, that, you know, indigenous communities, they're very good at adapting. They find, you know, solutions by changing the way that they interact with the environment. And we just don't seem to be able to understand that. We think, you know, technology will shield us rather than changing ourselves. So this is one area, I think, one example. In terms of, you know, kind of broader climate change discourses, global discourses, adaptation-wise. I think there's generally a bit of a difficulty for indigenous peoples to understand carbon. They understand health of ecosystem. So they understand that if, you know, trees are cut, ecosystem balance is, you know, lost. And once that happens, species will maybe, you know, become imbalanced as well. You know, the whole kind of, the balance tilts. And then you have a lot of change. And you know, you'll lose species, you'll lose animals and plant species, I mean. So then, you know, that's an issue. So for them, they just have much more of a felt experience with you know, the balance, the ecosystem itself. And carbon is just an abstract element that means nothing really out of it. It's just for us, like we see it as something, we see it as very important, the carbon. We don't even care about anything else that comes from the forest. We only care about the carbon, because our, you know, our reference point, our frame term of, you know, framework is climate change, and carbon emitted, you know, increases climate change. We don't even connect with the rest of the picture of changes that are happening. Others do that, right? Who work on biodiversity, for example, desertification processes, etc. So I think there's a lot, you know, that we really can learn from their, you know, their approach, their worldview in addressing our environmental issues.
Thanks so much for that. And let's see, we are cutting close to the end of our time here. So Sean, let's get to your question, and then we'll leave some time for any final thoughts or questions before we wrap up. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I was wondering, I live in California, and here we have a debate on whether to include a red-like offset protocol in our cap and trade system. And this new protocol would join the other existing offset protocols, which are US only. And if it's greenlit, this new protocol will direct money towards international conservation efforts, but it's unlikely to have good oversight, serious respect for indigenous rights. You know, in our messy, in this messy situation, what would you say to decision makers, to people that are involved in this debate, and would you ultimately endorse such an imperfect protocol?
Right, yeah. It really depends, you know, on how ambitious we want to be and what the answer would be. I mean, at the end of the day, I think in the West, we just need to do a lot less and we would achieve a lot more. We're just creating all sorts of incentives, and oftentimes these are kind of false incentives and they're warped incentives. You know, we're doing something by creating a program that helps us to not change anything at home, but then, you know, even channeling money into a community that doesn't operate through money is gonna, you know, create issues. It oftentimes creates, you know, divisions, you know, those who receive some money and those who don't, who then benefit from, you know, new infrastructure, and those who don't. And so we just keep mingling. I mean, the best thing for us would be to stop, you know, exploiting their natural environment, and reduce our consumption. I mean, that at the end of the day is really what we need to do. But not all policymakers will be happy with that, so they'd rather just create, you know, offset programs. And of course, this is a bit of a bland and kind of broad answer. And of course, it depends. I mean, there are communities who want to accumulate monetary wealth and have better lifestyles and you know, materialistic lifestyles. But I mean, we do too. It's kind of quite a sensitive issue. And so I think we need to just tread very carefully. And ultimately, I think we do need to look a lot more at what we do, you know, how we contribute to the challenges in other countries through our consumption, and also our policies and our system.
So my takeaway is sort of it's kind of the wrong question, that the whole mindset behind the topic is just is a frame of mind that it will not really work, and you know, to answer this question is kind of a moot point, and so you really don't have a strong stance either way.
It depends on whether you want, you know, a weak or a strong sustainability answer, perhaps. You know, do you want to have an answer to just tweak a little bit, like, you know, have incremental changes, or do you want to actually have a radical, you know, long-lasting change in effect? I mean, it really depends on what we're prepared, you know, to look at ourselves, I guess. But indirectly, I'm saying, I mean, this is my personal view. I find the offset approach a little bit problematic. I mean, it's maybe, you know, one step, and it has some kind of good outcomes in terms of awareness raising, for example. And, you know, we fly around the world. If we have to pay a few dollars for this, you know, to offset our emissions, at least we kind of start to think about it. But of course, we're not solving anything, because who knows how this money is going to be used. And so often, you know, more often than not in history, so far, many of these offset companies have not necessarily invested the money to the, you know, benefits of the local people, shall we say. I mean, there's a, you know, huge variety of quality of offsetting programs out there.
Thanks for those insights, Heike. And let's see, I'm gonna see if we can get Tim's question in there, and then I'll turn it over to Kamal for one final question. So Tim, go ahead.
Thanks for letting me ask so many things. I'm gonna just read what I typed, because I think that's my, I put it in the best words as I typed it. So in working directly with indigenous people, I often find myself nervous about my whiteness. I want to be sensitive to my outsider status and respectful of the traumas brought on to indigenous people by people who look like me. Do you have any advice for how to approach indigenous peoples with a sincere desire to support their cause while avoiding the perception of just another colonialist coming in to quote unquote help?
That's again a great question. In my experience, it is limited. I have found them to be very welcoming of us as people, rather than, you know, caring about our skin color first and foremost. I think as long as you are genuine and open and loving and caring and, you know, trustworthy, I think that's what matters. And I think they're, you know, they are able to differentiate. to my experience, fully. I mean, there have been very few who would have spoken out against us in the communities, saying, what do they want? They can't want anything good. Like, they will come and take something. What are they taking? So yes, there is distrust. But I've found that as soon as they've actually really interacted with us and understood our true intention, it was fine. So yes, we have a very bad rep. And yet if we come personally, you know, with our best of intentions, being on their side, and I think this is also something we so often emphasize, that we are on their side, and we are very, very sorry for all that has been, you know, happening to them from our systems, our governments. You can create some wonderful connections with them.
Thank you.
Okay, Kamal, do you want to ask a final question before as we wrap up?
I'm sure. I'm actually going to ask two questions. One is just a specific question. Early on, you had mentioned that conservation projects themselves can cause problems. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to that a little bit. Sort of how is it that, because REDD plus people are now talking about, even though it's supposed to benefit Indigenous people, there's a concern that it's actually going to make things worse. So if you can speak a little bit to, you know, what are those specific concerns? And then the second question is just a question we ask all our guest speakers, you know, as our students are looking to transition into climate work or put a climate lens on their existing work, do you have any general advice they can sort of find their path in this space?
Okay, so in the early days, there were also CDM projects already that created quite a lot of, you know, adverse impacts in terms of Indigenous communities losing and being pushed out of their lands, because now you couldn't hunt anymore, for example, and they were dependent on hunting for bushmeat. Of course, they always do this within reason, you know, only so much that they need subsistence-wise, never exploitatively. And then this is an important point I think I didn't actually mention before, but the safeguards, environmental and social safeguards were adopted. And this was adopted in 2000, gosh, I think 12, but don't quote me. It includes a range of safeguards addressing also Indigenous communities. So, you know, free, prior, informed consent, also, you know, governance, transparency, good governance in general. They need to be included in decision making upfront. You know, all these kinds of things are nowadays included, and sometimes it's still a challenge of actually putting this into practice, in that, you know, Indigenous communities are remote, they speak different languages. You know, somebody comes and speaks English to them or Spanish and they don't understand what is wanted from them. They are unsure. It's quite difficult, and again, it's not their worldview that carbon needs to be, you know, sequestered. I mean, that just doesn't make sense to them, rightly so, you know. You could argue it's just the Western way. So, well, yeah. So there have been all sorts of issues with them. Other issues have been around, you know, signing contracts for 30 years, so you cannot take, you know, fell another tree for 30 years. You know, what is that and why? And, you know, there can be a lot of confusion and you know, it's intimidating as well to many if Westerners come with these kinds of projects. Telling them they benefit, you know, they'll go to school, but they might have their own schooling kind of ideas and ways that they teach the younger through, you know, their own practices. They don't necessarily understand what it means to have a school, Western medicine, and etc., etc. So there's, you know, impingement in that way that may be disadvantageous for them. And then
do you have any? Yes,
yeah.
second question.
Second question. Climate change is such a wide area. I remember it was, I think, Steve Rayner a colleague of ours from Oxford who once said, and I loved it, he said, climate change is like a Christmas tree. You can hang anything you want on it. It just basically means that it's a very wide area. And of course, you know, you can engage in renewable energies, you can engage in food, because agriculture is such a driver of climate change in a number of ways. You know, one is deforestation, but another one is fossil fuels, you know, that are inputted into fertilizers and pesticides, and also transportation of around the planet. So and heating, you know, and other inputs into the farming process. So it's huge. It's a huge component, and a lot can be done, you know, in changing the food system that we currently have. There's, you know, so there's a lot of different areas within climate change that can be quite different from one another in terms of how to get into it. And also there's, you know, policy work, but then there's also grassroots kind of awareness raising work. There's information dissemination kind of work. I mean, it's just vast. So ultimately it depends on what, you know, what everyone is really interested in, or kind of wanting to make a difference on, you know, what they feel most passionate about. There's, I guess, it's good to, you know, to get involved in the communities around whatever area you're interested in. And also you're all welcome to, you know, get in touch with me personally if you want to have some ideas of, you know, contacts, who to get in touch with. That's oftentimes a good way. And seeing what, you know, what kinds of opportunities there might be that you can get involved with, what's needed, stuff like that.
That sounds great. Yeah, thanks so much for being willing to engage with our cohort, and yeah, for just being here for this wonderful conversation today. I'm gonna wrap things up for today, if that sounds good to everyone. Thank you for your questions and participation. And yes, this recording will be available for future reference.
Thank you so much, everyone, also for great questions.
Thank you, Heike.
And Leni, for setting us up together. That's really great.
And we'll share. Is it okay, Heike, since you offered, is it okay if we share your email address with the students on our?
Yes.
Sounds good. Thank you again.
Take care. Have
great.
a good evening. Yeah.
Take care, everyone.
You have a good day. Bye.